Right, so I want to do a bit more of an old school video for my channel, and that's regarding sort of in a shit hits the fan scenario, or some sort of, without rule of law scenario, what's better, swords or machetes? And I've sort of covered this before, but it's been years since I've done a video like this. I quite wanted to sort of do one like this again. So, obviously, I see a lot of people online that say, oh, sword's the best thing you can have, in a without rule of law scenario, and that might be true, but what I want to do is weigh up in this video the pros and the cons of each. So, what I've got here is my falchion, and this was a handcrafted falchion from Heron Armories. Very, very good, very competent sword. And if you don't know the history of sort of swords like falchions, these were the much easier swords for peasants to use, people who didn't really have training with swords. If you were conscripting a lot of soldiers and you had to give them a sidearm, a sword like a falchion was a very good choice. The reason for that is a falchion is very easily sort of manoeuvrable. It's generally heavier towards the hilt than the front. But falchions work a bit like an axe blade in a sense. Lots of falchions are a bit wider at the back than the front, as you might be able to see from the back to the front of this. So when you swing it, it gets a lot more of a sort of weight impact. Obviously it's got a good point on the front as well, if you were to thrust it, but overall the falchion is very easy to manage because the weight feels very, natural, if you like. You can get a good idea of how to actually use it. Now, the problem with actually lots of other medieval swords is that this is kind of a thing that you'd never understand from, watching Hollywood type things that would always get it wrong. But medieval swords actually took a lot of training to use, simply because if you have a double-edged sword and it's fairly long, you're going to need a lot of forearm muscles to wave it around effectively. And you're going to need to know a lot of almost like martial arts techniques for using the blade. Obviously you don't need much training to thrust it into somebody or swing it about like a machete, but you're not going to be very efficient at doing that, especially if the other person you're coming up against is trained in sword combat. Now, I'm not saying in a shit hits the fan scenario that your opponent is going to be trained in sword combat. That's definitely not what I'm trying to get at, because I think that's kind of a bit of a fallacious argument I see a lot of people making online. What if the people that might come up against you are like trained assassins? You need to know all these kung fu skills to beat them. It's like, no, you really don't. But obviously, the point I am getting at though is that a falchion is still much easier to use. And I'm sure everybody would agree with this statement. If you are having to use something to potentially save your life and use in self-defense, it is better to use something that's easier to learn how to use than something that's harder to learn how to use. So, the falchion, I'm obviously not going to swing it around properly because I'm inside, but you have got, a lot of power if you do swing it, and you obviously can do a lot of different manoeuvres with it, all of which are very easy to make the blade contact with an opponent, and it's obviously got a good point to it, which is very, very handy. Now, my falchion I had made with the handguard type setup, so you can punch with it, and it's very easy to block a blade that's coming in towards your hand. So if you were using this, you've obviously got a fair amount of reach, where you've got a point to the end, and you've got a lot of protection for your hand. So if you are waving it, even without too much skill at an opponent, it would be very hard for them to block the blade and pull it away from you, or go in to do damage to your hand because you've got a handguard and you've got a very competent blade. But let's assume that you don't have a sword. And obviously not all swords, as I was saying, are created equal. You've got sabres, cutlasses, whatever else. Some swords, of course, are much easier to use than others. So, obviously, what do you do if you don't have a sword? Most people, I think, would agree that for without rule of law scenario, SHTF kind of thing, that an actual machete is very good. The reason being, you can buy them for a fraction of the cost of a sword. A good sword like this normally costs somewhere between £200 and £400, maybe even more. This one was just over 400 if I remember when I ordered it. So a good sword costs quite a bit of money. And you really don't want to cheap out when you go to swords, because the wall hanger type ones are utter crap. Just as dangerous to you as anybody else. If you swung it around, it might fall apart and injure you, which you don't really want to have happen in some sort of nightmare end of the world scenario. So for a lot of people, the machete ends up becoming what they think about. Now obviously if you're in a country like America where you can own firearms, obviously everybody's going to have a firearm as the first choice, but machetes are much easier to use than swords. This is one I absolutely love. I've had it for years. I got it from Blades and Bows years ago. I think it's just called the Filipino Army Machete. But it's, you know, very competent. It's what you'd expect from your classic machete. Fast to swing about. There is a bit of a point for thrusting, but not really. You can probably tell that I've used and abused this quite a lot. The tip's a bit bent where I've been stabbing it into things before. But something like this, obviously I don't want to chop my camera up, but you can certainly swing it about very easily. Now, the thing with machetes is, compared to swords, is that a machete is generally much lighter. They are very good at chopping. Now, machetes, until you've actually tried swinging a sword around, then you swing a machete around back to back, you won't really realise just how much easier it is to swing a machete around, because a machete is much lighter, and you really can understand quite easily with a machete where the blade is going to go without training. Now, I was saying my falchion is much easier to use than a lot of classic swords, but if you actually went to something like a long sword, you know, or something like that, then you went straight to a machete, you'd say, wow, this thing is easier to swing around, just because of the weight and how it's balanced. There's not really a counterweight with a machete to the main blade, but as said, these are very easy to actually use and swing around. So, there's the machete. So this is your kind of classic machete, and it's what I'd recommend for a lot of people. But you can get other designs of machete that actually kind of come somewhere between a sword and a machete, which might be very, very practical. So let's look at those now. Right, what we have here is the Cold Steel Gladius machete. Now this thing is quite fearsome looking, as you can actually see. And what this is basically at one point Cold Steel decided, you know, there's a lot of swords people really like, so why don't we make machetes that sort of resemble those swords and have a load of the characteristics that those swords have. And that's sort of what they came up with these. Fairly long blade for a machete, as you can probably tell, and it's got a lanyard hole at the end, which I've put the lanyard on my wrist, but I think for this video, because my lanyard's a bit tight, I've just done a paracord, I won't bother. But essentially what you have is a double-edged machete with a very, very good point on it. So this is very easy to thrust, exceptionally easy to thrust. As you can see, obviously I wasn't trying to hit the camera there, but you can thrust this and you'll get a very good idea of where the blade is going to go very easily because of how the machete blade is set up. What you'll notice is this is very flat, so it's like an actual machete, it's not a thick blade. But obviously, if this was to impale somebody or something, it's going to make a very wide wound channel because of the shape of the blade. Now, of course, you can swing this as well. It doesn't quite swing as well as a real machete simply because it's double-edged. So the weight isn't helping it to bring it down on one side, but it's obviously easy enough to learn how to swing. But the main sort of point to this is the point. This would obviously be very good at thrusting, and that's what they designed it for. Now, a machete you can very competently wield with one hand. You use it with your main hands. Obviously I'm right-handed, I'd use it with a right hand. That also means that if you were using it for self-defense in one of these situations, you could probably have quite a good flashlight in your other hand. Keep that on the attacker's face. The attacker is obviously going to be blinded, won't be able to actually swing at you because they're going to be trying to block the light. And that means that you've got pretty much free reign of your machete. It'd only be if somebody actually had a firearm, I wouldn't want to try that. But, as I said, a bit of body armour on yourself, flashlight in one hand, machete in the other, you're going to be in a pretty good situation to deal a lot of damage out. And here's another machete that comes somewhere between a sword and an actual machete. This is the Alkridge, I think it's called Parang machete. But this kind of reminds me of a cutlass, as I've said before. It's got much more of a cleaver blade to this one, if you look at it, like a big butcher's cleaver, than an actual real machete blade. But it's got quite a bit of length to it as well. And it's got a bit of a handguard. I wouldn't trust this handguard to take multiple hits and survive, but you know, at least one or two hits aren't going to chop your fingers off if somebody swung something similar at your hand. Now, I said I don't want to swing it too hard because I've not got ceilings and walls too far away, but this thing has got a very competent actual blade to it, and yeah, you couldn't thrust as well with this one. It's got a bit of a point, but thrusting is going to feel a bit odd with a weapon like this. Again, it's not going to be too hard, but I wouldn't expect a blade to penetrate very much because it's not got a blade edge here. Of course, you could probably grind an edge onto it here, and then, yeah, it would stab fairly well. But the point of this mostly is for chopping, and obviously it's going to be pretty intimidating, I guess, if you're an attacker, somebody swinging one of these at you. Again, much more for cleaving than it is actually for stabbing, but again, it crosses the gap between a sword and a machete quite well. So, in my opinion, there is a lot more to go on, I think, if you are getting a machete for an end-of-the-world type scenario, whichever type of scenario that might be, zombie apocalypse, something similar to that, you know, just some sort of Mad Max type thing, or just a theoretical breakdown of law for a temporary period because of, you know, something going on in your country, civil unrest. I think machetes generally have much more use than a sword. That's not to say swords don't have a use, of course they do, but I think for the amount of training and expertise to wield them, I'd personally be much happier wielding a machete, because a well-made machete is very easy to know where the weight of it is going. Now, I'm just going to get a really strong flashlight, and then we can have a look at what it might be like to use a flashlight in one hand and a machete in the other. Okay, so let's say you're breaking into my house. I hear a noise, I come out, and I'm expecting, because this is some sort of without rule of law situation, that the person coming at me, from the perspective of your camera, you're the person coming at me, and obviously you're armed. Maybe you've got a knife, maybe you've got your own machete, maybe you've got an axe, you've got a crowbar, whatever. Obviously for this scenario I'm saying nobody has firearms, so I'm doing it in the account of the UK, where obviously some people do have firearms illegally as well. But for this scenario I'm just going to kind of assuming that, for the sake of argument, obviously you don't. Because if we're going to go down the route of everybody has firearms and I have a firearm myself, because that's, you know. So anyway, theoretically you're coming at me with some sort of melee weapon, and I know that there might be trouble, so I've got my gear all on. So flashlight in one hand and I've got my machete in the other. So you're coming at me, all of a sudden, well, you can't see very well because I've got this flashlight going into your eyes, and thrust, thrust, you're dead. Hack, hack, you're dead. Obviously I could strobe this as well if I wanted to. So as you can see, as silly as that might look indoors, I think actually having a flashlight in your left hand, if you've got something where you can manage that sort of setup, and machete here, maybe if you weren't wearing a riot helmet, or even with a riot helmet, you could actually have a really high strength head flashlight on. And with that head flashlight you could probably do a similar thing. While you're constantly looking at somebody, they can't really, you know, get a good look at you. They're trying to put their arm up rather than actually attack. And then thrust. Obviously thrusting a machete like this into somebody's belly is probably going to do them in fairly easily. Big blade like that, it's going to leave a very big wound channel if a blade like this just goes right into you. Obviously if you compare the size of this blade to my neck, if a blade like this actually thrust into somebody's neck, you're almost going to totally sever their head, I'd imagine, from this going in a good few inches. Not actually enough to decapitate somebody, but enough to end them. So there you go. Somebody who's shining something like that at you and the blade came in, it's going to be very hard for you to actually form a defence against it. So, in a without rule of law scenario, I really do think personally that machetes would beat swords, simply because you need less training to use a machete. They are much, much cheaper to get a good machete than a good sword. I'd say 10% of the price normally. £30 for a good machete, £300+ for a good sword. But either would work fairly well. Another thing of machetes is they are much easier to look after. High carbon steel swords tend to rust very easily, you need to constantly oil them and things like that. A machete like this, despite it being carbon steel, you can see a bit of rust on it. I've never really bothered oiling this. I wipe it down normally after I've been using it and that's it, because for £30 for a big blade like this, I do not care when it eventually rusts away after many, many years of use. With a big sword, obviously, where I've spent £500 on something like that, I am going to obviously want to keep that in good condition. Another thing is, let's say the without rule of law scenario ends. Now, obviously your life isn't worth a set amount of money, but in a without rule of law scenario, let's say it ends and the police come round and they say, oh look, we know you killed somebody, that's kind of fine, you had to do it. I know that sounds too reasonable for the police, but whatever, the newly established government says that, but they say unfortunately we have to confiscate the weapon you used. Would you rather lose a £30 machete you can easily replace, or a sword? I'd go for the machete personally. And as I said, something like this is very, very easy to use. You don't need to thrust well with it to make a lethal hole in somebody. And if you're attacking somebody with one of these, it's going to be very hard to come at somebody who's actually wielding a big blade. There's lots of videos you can find online where the police are actually trying to arrest somebody with a machete and they have like 30 officers all running around panicking, not being able to get close enough to tase them or pepper spray them or whatever. And if you've got 30 police officers with armour on that are scared of one person with a machete, I'm pretty sure a burglar with ill intent is going to be absolutely terrified of somebody coming at them in a close space environment with something like this. So there you go, that's my summary of what do I think is better, machetes or swords in a sort of without rule of law scenario. I definitely think machetes myself.